give me a thumbs up. I know you guys can't see me yet, at least I don't think you can. Here we go. Can you guys see me? Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. So I am trying a new platform out here. Bear with me one second. I am let's see. Yep, okay. Thank you guys. I was messing around with this yesterday and it started sending out notifications. I was like, "Oh no, don't do that." So this is Streamyard. Uh Hopefully the color and the audio comes in pretty good. And I've got some slides I want to go through today from the conference that I spoke at in Oklahoma back in October. So I was going to do this, but I couldn't share the slides on just YouTube. I had to do it through a third party, which of course I had to wait for my internet to get up to, you know, some kind of reasonable speed to be able to begin to do all this stuff that I want to do. So that is where we're at today. I got my glasses always go in like crooked when I put them on my headphones. Okay, I don't know. I get like self-conscious about that. Plus, my eyes are always kind of like shifting. All right. Well, hello, hello. Let me go back up here to the top to say hi to everybody. Maybe not. Let's see. Lapinko, Jason Allen, Nikki Larson, Jules, um, Barbara Simon, Pam College, Gloria Minix, Sarah Rose, Kate J, Juwanda, Carol Lynn, Carol V, Wait Him. Let's see who else. Abba's girl, Carol, Linda, Jackie Christ, Ann Johnson, Jess, Allison, Anita. Hey, Anita, how are you? Deanna, Lena Scott, Sue Cawthron. Well, hello to everybody. Again, this is the Monday Live at noon Central Standard Time. And I have an article that's coming out. It's not ready yet. It's called The Bleeding Edge, but it should be out within the next day or so. And I will post that, and whenever that's done, I will post that on there. So I just a quick administrative update for me. Um, Tim, a friend of mine, Tim, had sent me a bunch of audio video equipment that he wanted me to have, and I right now at the present time you see all the boxes behind me, but I don't have space to do that. So I have all these dog cages in here, and what we're going to do is buy I guess you can buy cages now that are like desk or like um, tables, or I mean, I guess there's all manner of things, not kind of like bookshelves, but where you would set your lamps and trinkets and pictures and things on, but underneath that is a dog cage. So the plan is to get the over here set up behind me toward the cross with the dog cages that serve out also as a table, and then also bring in another table that I can start setting all that stuff out on, and then I'll probably have to call him and have him walk me through a lot of this stuff. But I mean, hopefully I can transform this little office, this crowded office, into something more professional looking. So, um, anyways, that's kind of the plan. Uh, Also, still on track to go to Australia, New Zealand at the end of January with Tom Hughes, Brandon Holdhouse, Billy Crone, and I think Mondo Gonzalez is going with us. And that'll be the 29th of January through like the 5th of February for me. And then April 12th, 13th, I think it is. Let me double check here. It is the 3. Yeah, April 12th, which is a Friday night, and Saturday, April 13th of 2024 would be myself, Lee Brainerd, and Mondo speaking at the Guthrie, I guess it's the Baptist church there in Guthrie, and Guthrie, Oklahoma, which is it's just north of Oklahoma City, not far, I guess 20, 30 minutes north of there. And then the May 4th conference in Madison, Mississippi, will be. I'll post some flyers for that too as well if you're in that area, within driving range to go there. And that will be me and Jeff Kinley speaking at that. And then trying to think what else. I think that's it for right now. Those are the upcoming conferences. Now, my preferred 2024 outlook would be that the Lord comes back, January 1st, and then we're all out of here anyway. So, but until he comes back, I'm going to keep staying busy and keep proclaiming the soon coming of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So let me get this set up here real fast. I want to get back to the Rev310 chat on. Let me find it here. It's the Rev310 chat on Telegram. Okay, I'm on. So Anita, I'm on there. If you need to post questions, I'll be monitoring that right now. And then there was some talk about moving some stuff over to Discord. For those that want to join the Discord community, it is, if you go to my website, the main page at the bottom there where it talks about the contact, or you can just go to the contact page on About Me. And I think it's on a couple of different pages on my website. There is links and descriptions on how to get onto Discord for those folks that want to get on there. And so now that I have a third-party platform, I'm going to attempt to do a Friday live on Rumble. I'm going to kind of play around with this week and see if I can't get it up and running by this Friday. So anyways, that's kind of the gist of what's happening right now. So, all right, I can see the chat on the right. I can see the chat here on the right through this platform here. But once I get going, I'm not going to really be able to monitor it. So just a few more people. Beam a seat, welcome. Matthew Prutch, if I'm saying that right. TPC, Marcia, and Jean, Edie Roscombe, Crystal Bedford, Log Cabin Artist, Linda Stilley, and others. Folks, welcome, and thank you guys for coming today. So today we're going to be going over what I presented at the Oklahoma Prophecy Conference. It's called Vanishing Point. And, imagine this slide's not going to let me do this on YouTube the way it's the format is, but a lot of these slides were build slides. So, you'd have a picture here, and then I'd click on something and you'd start to see the page populate with things on there that I was talking through. So this doesn't have that capability on here for me to do that on here. At least not that I've been able to do. I'm sure it does at some point. And the genesis of this idea of vanishing point, obviously, is that a vanishing point is an optical illusion. So I put on here the cover page or the title slide, this road. And so when you're looking at it from this vantage point, it looks like the road is beginning to converge at the very end of it, like it comes together. Now, I use the title and the optical illusion as simply as an illustration of what we're seeing today. The illustration is very real, and the reality of the illustration is very real. So I don't want that to be missed on anybody. I understand that it's an optical illusion. However, it's pointing to something that I see is happening, and very, very apropos for today's climate. Now, earlier I was watching some apologetics videos, and I believe one of them was a guy named Dr. Frank Turek. I'm sure most of you might be familiar with him, but he does a lot of these speeches um, presentations at universities and places like that, where he has a Q&A section at the end, and he does a lot of apologetics type responses to atheists and other folks that are there, seeking to challenge him or whatever. And I've never really seen him flustered on anything. I've never seen him like, there wasn't really anything anybody's really presented to him that really, caught him off guard or anything. I mean, he's very good at what he does, and he argues from the what we call the classical apologetics method. And what that means is he uses logical proofs outside of scripture to prove the necessity for a creator. And once you can get that established, that there is a creator and there is somebody above um, humans that can establish absolute truth, can establish absolute good, absolute evil, et cetera, then you begin to work through the different varying forms of arguments under those subcategories. We use cosmology, you can use science, the scientific method, archaeology, history, morality, ethics, and so on, to kind of build your case that Christianity is true, and that God is real, Christianity is true, and that Jesus is the Messiah come in the flesh. And I this is I don't know if it's a growing number. It seems to be, at least on YouTube and some other social media platforms. Hey, John, there seems to be other platforms, or this seems to be a growing, not a medium, but a growing um, platform, I guess, for a lot of the what we'd call reformed theology and non-dispensational theologians who approach the question of God and the truth in Christianity from these kind of either a classical methodology or evidential, or you know I guess even presuppositional, all these different types of apologetic categories that you can go into and make those arguments based on those varying types of arguments, right? And one of the things I've noticed is that um, none of them use prophecy, and I get it though. I mean, I understand why they don't. Y- you know, and I would say that most dispensational theologians don't make the circuits going out debating atheists. Typically a dispensationalist, like let's say Dr. Tommy Ice, if he's going to debate somebody, it's going to be somebody from the post-trib position or pre-wrath or something, one of those other, these are already Christians who want to debate something. I think Mark Hitchcock had a great debate with Hank Hanegraaff years ago. And if you haven't watched it, you need to go back and watch that. And Hank, coming from the partial preterist position, just gets demolished. And you can see him getting really, really flustered. I mean, just his face is red. He's just, um, anyways, most dispensationalists, we tend to focus on prophecy because, and as I mentioned in the last live update, prophecy is so all encompassing. It's throughout the entire Bible. It's the culmination of every other doctrine. That the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy, as it reads there in Revelation 19:10. So, I mean, there is so much within prophecy in and of itself that it seems to, for at least for us, it overshadows a lot of these other real basic elemental arguments we see within Christian, um, you know, the other sections of Christianity, like Reformed theology and all the other groups that don't touch prophecy, don't want anything to do with prophecy. They typically just avoid it altogether. But if they do come out and talk about it, it's always from an amillennial or post-millennial or post-tribulational position, or preterist position. So for them, this is not a this is kind of like do not touch kind of thing. Don't open this box over here. But for me, prophecy has been proven to be one of the most um, powerful proofs that we have that not only God exists, but that Christ, Christianity is true, and that Jesus Christ is God come in the flesh. But also, in addition to all those three, that we're running out of time, and that time is not just going to continue on ad nauseum, into the future forever and ever and ever. As we are today, like the way the world is today is not going to just continue on and on and on. But there's an end point to all this, right? And I watched these videos somewhat frustrated because, at least in this last one, Frank is, debating or taking questions from this really calm lady. She is presenting her arguments in a very calm manner. She doesn't seem unhinged or anything. And she's basically flustering Frank, from a lot of different angles. And I've never seen Frank like that before. So I didn't get to watch the entirety of the exchange between the two. But I'd never seen him kind of in that position before. But I thought, it would be so easy if you need evidential proof that God is real. You look no further than than the nation of Israel. And so uh, I can't remember who it was. This was back in the 1800s, and the king was asking his, right hand man, whoever it was, can you prove that God is real or the Bible is true? And the guy said, yeah, I can, in just one word. And he was like, well, what's the word? And he's like, it's the Jew. And so I want to get into that. And so from that perspective, I took two different things within Christian eschatology, and I said, out of all of the things that can prove where we are in time, and all, not just where we are in time, but that God is real, the Bible is true, Christianity is the only way to salvation. And I can summarize it in kind of these two prophetic points. And this is what's going to encapsulate this presentation here. So we have the nation of Israel, and we have the convergence. These are my 2 points. And if you look at them as a railroad track, as I have in the diagram there, you see that they begin to come together down the road. And again, this is just an illustration, but um, it makes a powerful visual, in that those two things, as they come back into alignment, you're going to start to see them coming closer and closer and closer and closer. And for one of them, for instance, let me go to Amos 9:14 through 15. And in here it says, I will bring back the captives of my people Israel. They shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink wine from them. They shall also make gardens and eat fruit from them. I will plant them in their land, and no longer shall they be pulled up from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God. So this is one of those thus saith the Lord statements in Scripture. And in here we see, even if we look at this historically, right? We know that Israel back in the 9th century, or the 10th century BC, divided between the northern 10 tribes, which was which was called Israel, and then the southern kingdom was the 2 tribes and of Judah. So you had Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Now they both were conquered. One the first time, the Israel was conquered by the Assyrians, and then the Judah was conquered by the Babylonians. And we know that out of those 2 diaspora, or those 2 conquerings, if you will, that they were allowed to come back into their land around the 530-ish BC, under when the Persians conquered the Babylonians. So Cyrus conquered, I think it was, I can't remember the Babylonian emperor's name, who saw the finger writing on the wall. He had taken the vessels from the temples, and was using them to party and stuff. And it wasn't Nebuchadnezzar. It was Belshazzar. No. I'm blanking on the guy's name. Anyways, we see that but when they came back into their land, it wasn't just the two tribes in Judah. You had Jews from all over that had come back and recongregated back in the south. So we see in Acts chapter 1 and 2 that Jews from all over had come. They were coming to Jerusalem. And you had representation, Belshazzar. They had, thank you. The Arrow Princess. Did I say that right? But we see that there's Jews from all over the world coming back to Jerusalem to celebrate the Pentecost or Shavuot, and the tribes that were supposedly lost. I mean, there was representation from all the tribes there. So Judah had essentially become the kingdom for Jews to repatriate back into by the fourth, third, second centuries, even up until the time of Christ. So that was the first time that they were taken away was in the fifth. Well, let's just stick with Judah. But the first time that they were conquered was by the Babylonians in the 605 BC to 585 BC. There was three different conquests through there. They were returned back to their land, just as Jeremiah prophesied 70 years later by the Cyrus king, or the Persian king Cyrus, and they remained in their land up until the second time they were conquered, which was under the Romans, and this was under General Titus Vespasian and his legions. They went in and were putting down a rebellion. It turned into a siege, and the next thing you know, I mean, a million Jews were killed. I mean, Josephus writes about this, and it's a horrific time in Jewish history. Largely centering around the 9th of Av. And now, after this, the Jews were, pretty much kicked out of Israel. Now, not all the Jews. There were still Jews in the area and still remaining in different parts of what we would call Israel today. And by 135 AD, we also see that there was a second rebellion. Actually, this would have been the third rebellion called the Bar Kokhba revolt. And this time, Emperor Domitian cast out all the Jews from the land. He salted the land so nothing could grow in it, cut all the trees down, renamed the whole area Syria, Palestina, after the Jews' ancient enemies, the Philistines. So Palestine is a Latin form of Philistine, and renamed Jerusalem area. I can't even say the name. Area Capitolina or something to that effect. And he was trying to erase the Jewish history from the land, and the Jews were forbidden to come into Jerusalem. They could only come in one day a year. And then, pretty much the Jews were scattered into diaspora for the next, 1900 years. Right. And so their rebirth in 1948 signals something had changed. And here we see in this passage here where it says, and no longer shall they be pulled up from the land I have given them. So this could not have applied to the previous two times under the Romans or under the Babylonians, but is specifically dealing with now, because we see all the things going on in the world today. There's this huge push to divide the land and to destroy Israel and so on and so forth. And here God's promising, hey, once you're back in your land, you're not going to be pulled up anymore. Now, this also mirrors another passage in Isaiah, particularly 11:11, that says that, talks about Israel being brought back a second time. And let me just read that real quick. Sorry, I thought I had this open already. So Isaiah 11:11, and we read here. Now the whole chapter is very messianic and talks about a lot about the kingdom and stuff, about the future of Israel. But this passage in particular is the one I wanted to highlight. Isaiah 11:11 says, "It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people who are left from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, and Shinar, from Hamath and the islands of the sea. And he will set up a banner for the nations, and will assemble the outcast of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth." Now, that is the second time. So the second time was 1948. This has never happened before. And I'll put in the link in the show notes. But there's been numerous times in the last, since the early 1800s, for European powers that were trying to establish a Jewish state in different places in the world. They had tried to establish a Jewish state in Tasmania. They tried to establish a Jewish state in a part of Eastern Russia. They tried to establish a Jewish state in Uganda, or what is now Kenya. So there's been numerous attempts to try and reestablish the nation, a place for the Jews to call their homeland on different places and different times. But this never happened. It never came to fruition. And it took basically, two world wars to and the Holocaust for this to happen. But it did happen. And so, as a sidebar, I had a friend of mine who is a Christian, and he was, really not happy with the way Israel is responding to Hamas during this whole thing. And he's basically arguing that the Jews that are there now are not the real Jews. And I'm like, dude, first of all, we have a Jewish Bible, right? The Old Testament and the New Testament is 99% written by Jews. We have a Jewish Messiah, who physically lived in the land of Israel today, and is coming back and is going to set foot on the land of Israel in the Mount of Olives. When he comes back a second time and touches foot on the earth, it's going to be at the Mount of Olives, and it's going to split the earth, or split that mountain in two, and it's going to totally terraform the land there. And Israel is called the apple of his eye, of God's eye. This is his land, not the world's land. This is his land. And, anybody that tries to divide is going to be crushed. Jerusalem has been made a burdensome stone to all the nations in the world, and everybody that tries to move it is going to destroy themselves in the process. I mean, there is so much. Genesis 12:3, the fact that God tells Abram, through your descendants, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to bless the world, and they'll be like the stars in the sky. You won't be able to count them. And he goes, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And that has never been rescinded. That is one of those unconditional promises or covenants that God made with Abraham. And there was several different unconditional covenants we see in the Old Testament that weren't dependent upon Israel's behavior, whether good or bad. They were there because God deemed it so. Now, there are conditional covenants like the law, the Mosaic covenant, where, the 613 laws there, that if you do this, this is going to happen. If you do this and obey me, I will bless you this way. And if you don't do these things, I'm going to curse you. And there's the if then kind of clause to those things. So the fact that Israel is back in their land validates Bible prophecy. It validates the truth of Scripture and God's word, that he is not done with the Jewish people, that there is still unfinished business. And all those promises that were given throughout the Old Testament to the nation of Israel, not to the church, not to Christians, not to Catholics, not to Muslims, not to anybody else, but to the specific ethnic group of people, the Jews that come from the 12 tribes, that they are blessed on account of their forefathers and the promises and covenants God made with them. And we also see in Romans 11 that there's a temporary blindness put on them until the fullness of the Gentiles, or the times of the Gentiles, comes in. So there's a period of time that this blindness is going to be upon the Jewish people. That's why they're so hostile to Christianity right now. But that's going to change, and God tells us that's going to change. So the first undeniable proof that Bible prophecy is true is that Israel is back in her land, right? Now, that is, if you talk to any dispensationalist, you talk to any, Bible prophecy scholar from even varying different viewpoints, they would all kind of say, okay, well, Israel's a super sign, because once she came back into her land, that's when everything began to, all these other things began to really kind of come out. And so the second point was the convergence. Now, when we read the Olivet Discourse, Jesus lists, he's asked these three questions by his four disciples about the end of the age. And he starts listing off all these things: wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, pestilence, signs in the heavens, the love of many will grow cold, etc. Deception. He mentions deception four times. So he has all these signs, but where he differentiates this from just a general list of signs, he said it's going to be like birth pangs. And anybody that's had a child knows that a woman, when she's pregnant, she goes through three different trimesters. But by the third trimester, she's starting to have these. They'll start off as Braxton Hicks contractions, but those will lead to real contractions, and ultimately to the point where she's ready to deliver that baby, that child, in the act of birth, right? So this is that Jesus alluded to the signs as being like that they would all start to increase in frequency and intensity until that time at the end when the birth happens. And I believe the birth is going to be the rapture of the church. But now here in Matthew 24:33, Jesus says something very specific. He says, when you see all these things happening, know that I am near, even at the door. When you see all these things happening, all being the key word here. Now, throughout the last 2,000 years, arguments can be made that yes, there's been wars, there's always been pestilence. We had the Black Plague in the 13th century or whatever that killed, a quarter of Europe's population. We've had all these terrible wars and things happening, but here it's when he says, when you see all of these things happening, and this is that convergence point. So you have Israel, and then you have the convergence as the two key signs of the end. Now, if you go to 1 Corinthians 1, chapter 1, verse 21 through 25, here's what Paul writes. He says, for since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For Jews request a sign, and Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. And so this is part and parcel why we have Bible prophecy and why that ties in with the nation of Israel. It's not so much for us necessarily as it should be for the nation of Israel to show them that they're about to come to this conclusion, or to the time of Daniel's 70th week, this last week of years that was prophesied for them as a nation. Now, let's just back up a little bit to when Christ came the first time. Now, Daniel's 70 weeks, we know that but the end of the 69th week was where Christ was crucified. And so we know that the Jews at that time had the book of Daniel available to them. They had it for 400 and something years, And so they should have had a reasonable understanding, if they took that seriously, when the Messiah was going to arrive. We know that the Gentile wise men that presumably came from Parthia, which was the kingdom east of Judah at the time, modern day Iraq and Iran, that those wise men came over and presented, first they showed up in Jerusalem, this big, probably entourage, looking for the one born king of the Jews. And this freaked Herod out. Herod turns to his Pharisees and is like, what are they talking about? Because Herod wasn't a true Jew. He was Idumean. I can't even say the word. Idumean, whatever. He's half Jewish. I think he was from the area of like a Samaritan, kind of mixed Jewish Gentile blood. But he was appointed by the Romans to rule there as a king underneath emperor at the time. And he was freaking out because now here's one born king this is the one that was born king of the Jews. And this was a threat to his throne and to his lineage, for him to be able to pass on his own throne to his own son. And so he turns to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees quote Micah 5, but they kind of butcher it. They don't really read it. They don't read it the same way that it was written. They water it down. And so this is that kind of mindset that they quit believing that this Messiah was going to arrive. And so there was this mindset that in the Jewish culture at the time, there's only a couple of people that were really waiting for the Messiah to come. And so that was Anna the prophetess and Simeon there at the temple that recognized who Jesus was, even as a baby. Now, aside from the wise men, the Gentile wise men, and from the shepherds that were brought in by the angels, Jesus wasn't born to this big fanfare, this big royal celebration. I mean, he was an unknown. And you think about if you're in Rome at the time, or you're a Roman or Gentile, you would have had no idea who Jesus was. You probably weren't familiar with any of the prophecies in the Old Testament. But the Jews should have known. They should have known that if their Messiah was going to be cut off, presumably as an adult, all they had to do was back that up a few years and look at prophecies from the other places in the Old Testament, like in Numbers, where the star from the east, or the prophecy in Genesis 49 about the scepter departing from between the feet of Shiloh or of Judah when Shiloh comes. They should have just kind of put two and two together. They would have recognized. Now, this is all us looking back in hindsight, playing armchair quarterback kind of thing, But here we are a second time at the end of the age. And again, been given these signs, we've been given these things to look for at the end of the age. And we got so many within Christianity that refuse to even acknowledge that the Messiah is coming back, much less that he's coming back soon. And you have so many within the church that don't want to talk about it. This is just one of those subjects better left alone. And they are completely happy with the status quo of things. They don't want to upset the apple cart. They don't want to mix their hands in any of this stuff. So for them, this topic is just, it reminds me very much of the mindset that Jews had in the first century. So, all right, let me keep going here. Okay, let's go to Israel real quick. Israel, and I'm quoting here from Mark Twain. So Mark Twain visited Israel back in the mid 1860s, and when he came back, he wrote a book called Innocents Abroad, describing his visit there to Israel. And he wrote, Israel is a desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. We never saw a human being on the whole route, and there was hardly a tree or shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. And so his visit there in the 1860s showed there was hardly anything in Israel. Now, this picture is from 1875. And you can see the comparison here where Israel is today. And, this picture was in 2022. But by all rights, Israel should not have been a country again. There wasn't anything there. Here's another quote from him that I didn't include it in the conference because I didn't have time. I was limited to 1 hour. But here's something else to consider. Mark Twain says, if statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous dim puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are always way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world in all the ages and had done it with his hands tied behind him. Now, I'm going to continue here. I'm going to read the second part. Quoting him again, the Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, and then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other people have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight now, or have vanished altogether. The Jews saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality, of the Jewish immortality? Well, we know what the secret is. Now, Mark Twain, I believe, was agnostic or an atheist, at least as far as we know. Um, I, you know, I could just say he was not very religious or lean Christian or anything like that. So he's remarking on this from a kind of a from a religious standpoint. He's non-biased in that sense. He's not coming from a Christian perspective or a Muslim perspective or anything. He's not anything. And he's saying, what is the secret of his immortality? Speaking of the Jewish people, well, we know the secret of his immortality is that the God that he worships had made a promise to his forefather Abraham that his descendants would never would never would become like the sand grains of sand on all the beaches. I mean, they are, or even the stars in the sky. They would proliferate and would continue indefinitely, until at least the end of time, right? Until the end of the age. And so it's that is the secret, is the God he worships. The same God that the Jews worship, that gives them the immortality, is the same God that we worship. Now, we are, what I would call Christianity is kind of realized Judaism. It is fulfilled Judaism. It's fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ, who didn't come to abolish the law, but fulfilled it perfectly, right? And he is the embodiment of that. And when we place our faith and trust, our full faith and trust in him and his finished work on the cross, dying as that perfect sacrifice, shedding his blood for us as that innocent sacrifice, that the lamb slain, right? That is where we find our redemption, is in him, who is the embodiment of God in the flesh. So that's the same God we worship. Now, they have blinders on right now, and they have this veil put over their face for a time, but as they move into the 70th week, as that day of the Lord time frame comes into view and comes into to be after the rapture of the church, at the midpoint, that veil is going to be removed. And now they're going to start to see that Jesus was the Christ. And at the very end of the tribulation, we see them crying out for Jesus to come and rescue them, to save them, and that's when we see the second coming happening. So let me read here from Isaiah 11. Oh, I had it here. I forgot I had it here. It says, "And it shall come to pass in that day, the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people who are left from Assyria and Egypt, from Pathros and Cush, from Elam and Shinar and Hamath and the islands of the sea. He will set up a banner for the nations and will assemble the outcast of Israel, gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth." This also ties in with Jeremiah 37, or excuse me, Ezekiel 37, about the valley of dry bones and those being brought back together. They're brought back in unbelief. And what we've seen here is that Israel, since 1948, has largely been secular. Now, there is a growing, I don't know if it's a majority, a minority, that are very religious, whether it's the Orthodox or ultra Orthodox. But we start to see them kind of growing as the world is continually kind of becoming more anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. And so, in a way, this is if we think about the Jews in Europe, right, in the turn of the century, they started to see this anti-Semitism, and they started to, the observant ones were becoming very sensitive to this and starting to see that the tide turn in Europe against them, just as it has everywhere else they'd been throughout the last 2,000 years. They would go into a country, they would start off with nothing, they'd begin to flourish, they'd work hard, accumulate wealth, and then they'd start to do really well, and then that European or that country would become jealous of their success and begin to arrest them, throw them in jail, take all their wealth and their material, and basically kick them out of the country. I mean, that happened in England, that happened in Spain. We see them being put into pogroms in Russia around the turn of the 20th century. And so I see that kind of happening now. Whereas, let's just say before 1948, if you hated the Jews, you were considered anti-Semitic. But because of the atrocities in World War II by the German Third Reich and the Holocaust and the final solution and the 6 million Jews that were killed in the concentration camps, that that bought them a little bit of time. So the narrative shifted from anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism once Israel became a nation again. Even Jews were anti-Zionist. I mean, there's groups in New York that are anti-Zionist. They don't believe that we should be over there in Israel. And so now what we're seeing, I guess what we've seen since October 7th here in this last couple months, is that we not only have anti-Zionism on full display, but now anti-Semitism has come back in vogue. And we're starting to see people, all sorts of people carrying swastikas and all sorts of really, virulently anti-Semitic slogans and things like that, and speaking out on Twitter and all these other platforms. And these are people with, in respectable positions, in high levels of office in various places in industries, and they're just coming out saying it. Like, it's just like the veil has come off for them. They hate the Jews. They hate the Jews because of who they are. And what they're really saying is they hate the God who these Jews worship, who's the God of the Bible. Even if these Jews don't, even if they're secular Jews and they're atheist, the God who represents their people is the one the world hates. And they're the natural targets of opportunity, so to speak. Since they can't lash out at God specifically, they're going to lash out against his people. And the same thing happens to the church. As a Christian, if you are working at a public place and somebody comes to find out that you're a born again believer and that you don't approve of same-sex marriage, all that kind of those other hot button issues, or you're pro-life or whatever, then the attacks will start to come. They start to scrutinize your life and your social media. Next thing you know, you're looking for a job. So that's where this hatred is not necessarily just because they're Jewish, but because of who stands behind them, so to speak. Now, I wrote in here the timeline. This was just a brief kind of synopsis of the events. So Israel becoming a nation again didn't happen in a vacuum. There was a process. There was things that happened along the way that made this all possible. The two biggest being World War I and World War II. Where World War I basically prepared the land for the people, and World War II prepared the people for the land. In a nutshell, right? Prior to World War I, the Ottoman Turks controlled most of the Middle East for 400 years. All of that territory, there was no nation of Palestine. Simply just a territory that nobody lived in. Most of the land was owned by absentee landlords, Turkish landlords. They owned the land. They didn't live there because it was unlivable. But when the Ottoman Turks sided with the Central Powers in World War I and they lost, the French and the British began to carve up the Middle East, what had been their Ottoman Empire, and began to establish different nations and things. And so the true Palestinian state should be the nation of Jordan. That is actually the most, that is politically, that's the way it was supposed to be. But Jordan has since distanced themselves from them and are using those people, those Arabs that are there now, and those Egyptians and those other folks that are in the Gaza Strip and in what they call the West Bank. They're using them as pawns, political pawns, as weapons to drive, to basically put a thorn into the side of Israel. And so there will never be, they don't want those people back. The Egyptians don't want them. The Jordanians don't want them. No other Arab countries want them. They just want them there so they could be Israel's problem and not their problem. So they don't really care about those people. But then the second part of this was the World War II. And because of the anti-Semitism, I mean, you could go back to the Night of the Broken Glass or Kristallnacht, all the way through to the end when the Allies were liberating Europe. And, even General Eisenhower was walking through these camps and he's saying, I want you to document everything. I want photographs. I want video. I want everything documented because there's going to come a time when people won't believe this happened. And so, to his credit, thankfully, General Eisenhower and some of the other senior leadership were adamant that these things be chronicled and written about and photographed to show future generations that this actually happened. So there's even a growing number of what we'd call conservatives within, the conservative side of American politics that deny that the Holocaust was as bad as it was. They think it's all kind of Zionist propaganda. and it just blows my mind. It just blows my mind. Um, so I just I see that I see that now becoming not just not just an issue within conservative politics in America, although it is a dividing wedge that I wrote about in my article Equivocation. Um, but it is also dividing the church because the church had for so long abandoned Bible prophecy. They no longer see the significance of Israel being back in their land. To them, this is all a geopolitical problem that the Jews were done away with. And whether they come out and say that they're supersessionist or replacement theologians or whatever, they might deny it all the day long. But the fact that they remain silent and refuse to take a stand on any of these issues from the pulpit seems like they're tacitly supporting this idea of replacement theology. Now, just before I came on, I listened to another apologetics, a Christian apologetics ministry, talk about what their position of Israel was. And this was, I think, all after October the 7th. And so they're saying, basically the same thing, that the Jews that are there are not God's chosen people anymore. That this issue is largely geopolitical, blah blah blah. And not saying that they approve of what happened on October 7th. They see this as an ongoing problem where both sides are at fault. And so they don't see the spiritual warfare behind this and the significance of what's going on as anything other than just another conflict in the world. And so because they've been blinded and have their blinders on with amillennial viewpoints or preterist or postmillennial viewpoints or whatever, they can't understand the significance of Israel being back in her land. For them, this is just not an issue. But irregardless, and I know that's not a word, of the fact that what their viewpoints are, they cannot deny the fact that Israel becoming a nation again is not a fulfillment of those passages in the Old Testament that said that they would. Primarily, I'm Amos 9, Isaiah 11, Ezekiel 37, Matthew 24, Luke 21. I believe it's 20, 21, 24. Jesus says, 21, 24, and they will fall by the edge of their sword and be led away captive, speaking of the Jews, into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Paul said that there would be a blindness on Israel until the time of the end. He wrote about there being another temple. You're not going to have a temple, a Jewish temple there to desecrate at the tribulation if Israel is not in control of the land. The Antichrist is not going to go in and desecrate the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He's not going to desecrate some Hindu temple somewhere else. We're talking about the third Jewish temple. And whether I don't think that we should support the building of it, but I think it's going to be built regardless of whether we support it or not, because the Bible says it will be. Specifically, when you look at Matthew 24. So at the beginning of Matthew 24, Jesus, they're leaving the temple. He'd been teaching there, and his disciples are standing back, kind of looking at it. Presumably, it's at the end of the day. The sunset's hitting the temple just right, and just gorgeous. And by all measures, it was one of the wonders of the ancient world. And he says, don't marvel at this. Not one stone will be left on top of the other. And then he walks off. So of course, their curiosity is piqued. Four of them go up and ask him this question as they get to the Mount of Olives. And then he launches into what we call the Olivet Discourse, because it took place on the Mount of Olives, and he begins to tell them what's going to be the signs leading up to the time of the end. And he goes through this litany of signs, and then he says, and at the midpoint, let the reader understand, or read Daniel, that there is going to be one that makes a desolate, an abomination that makes desolate. And I'm butchering that. Let me go back and read it. Matthew 24:15. And I should get some background music to play while I'm doing stuff like this. He says, and therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the house on the housetop not go down and take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. So this is specifically speaking to people in Jerusalem who are under some type of Judaism, laws of Judaism, where these are not going to be enforced in a Muslim nation. These are not going to be enforced in a Gentile nation. Neither would a Gentile nation, if they controlled the land of Israel, allow the temple to be rebuilt. Israel has to be in control of the nation in order to be able to control the city of Jerusalem, in order to be able to control what happens on the Temple Mount. And if you look at it from the opposite way, from backwards, it's the same thing. Israel has to be in control of the land. But in order for there to be an abomination that causes desolation, as per what we see in Daniel 9, the temple has to be rebuilt. It has to be rebuilt. You can't desolate something that's not there. They're not going to desolate. It's not speaking about the desolation of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So, and the desecration did not happen in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. It was destroyed for sure, but it was not desolated in the way that Antiochus Epiphanes did it 2 centuries prior, where he went into the Holy of Holies and erected a statue of Zeus and then slaughtered a pig on the altar. That is the desecration. Now that happened in the past, but Jesus is saying, hey, this is going to happen in the future to him. Paul says this was going to happen future to him. So both Jesus speaking here roughly 33 AD, 32 AD, somewhere at the end of 32, maybe the beginning of 33 AD, or no, this was right before his crucifixion, so this would have been in 33 AD. He said it was future. Paul, writing 20 years later, 25 years later, said that it was future to him when he wrote about this in the 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. We see that that there is a temple standing again when John is given the revelation, and that was in 95 AD, and he said that was in the future. So this isn't something that had happened, and it would have had to have happened prior to 70 AD. Was the last time the Jewish temple has been standing. After that, it's been destroyed. There's never been a Jewish temple. So it didn't happen prior to 70 AD, which means it has to happen in the future, which means another temple has to be rebuilt, which is why when these red heifers made the news not long ago, and everybody starts getting excited because that was kind of like the first thing they needed in order to be able to sacrifice these perfectly red-haired heifers in order to sacrifice their bodies, burn the ashes, and mix the ashes with water, and then sanctify their materials and themselves, and wash all these things, purify this stuff, in order for them to begin to do the temple operations. So preparatory to that. All right, so let me continue here. Now, speaking to convergence, I put on here kind of just a montage of pictures of things going on in the world. And on the left, top left, you see this was the sky, I believe it was in Canada, was just completely red from the smoke and all the fires that they had, the unrest in France, Agenda 2030. You've got the Gog, kind of Magog forces beginning to align. You've got the U.S. collapse of the Afghanistan mission, starvation. You've got North Korea or China doing invasion drills of Taiwan, UFOs, the Maui wildfire, COVID. Just all these things. These are things that have been going on here for the last 20 years or so, and it's happening so fast, and so there's so much happening that it's hard for us to keep up. And when if I ask you, if you remember back to the summer of love, as they call it, back in summer of 2020, that seems like a lifetime ago. when everybody was protesting in their cities and rioting and burning everything down. That seems like 15, 20 years ago, but it was only not even been 3 years. So much has happened between then and now that it's really everything is happening so fast and coming at us so quickly, from all over now, and with so many different platforms of information bombarding us with this news. It's really hard to keep up with these things anymore. Um, but here, the second prophetic proof, that shows beyond a shadow of doubt that we're in the last days is this convergence. Number one, that Jesus came the first time, initiating the last days, and that's why we know we're in the last days, as it says there in Hebrews 1:1. Number two is that knowledge and travel would increase. There is written in Daniel 12:4. Both of those things, in and of themselves, um, demonstrate to even the most ardent skeptic that the world is where the Bible said it was going to be thousands of years ago. Now, let's just say hypothetically that Jesus said, when he was asked there about the last days, what would be the sign? Let's just say that Jesus had said, um, the world's going to be peaceful. All the nations are going to get along. We're going to have beaten our swords into plowshares, and then the end will come. Like that. If you were to compare that statement with the way the world is today, obviously that's laughable. That's just as laughable as the ancient Egyptians believing that the Earth and the solar system or whatever was carried on the back of a giant turtle. That's what they believed. It's laughable because we would obviously, but Jesus didn't say that. He said the world, there's going to be deception, like there would be a time of deception that the world had never seen before. Wars and violence and murder, scarcity of food, pestilences, hatred of God, and the persecution of believers, earthquakes and other seismic events, global fires, smoke, gloom and volcanoes, solar flares, near Earth objects, hurricanes, typhoons, ocean death, water scarcity, alien invasion. These are things not just in the Olivet Discourse, but also in Revelation, talking about the time of the end. And I have, with each of those sections, I have passages in Scripture that goes along with it, speaking about those things, right? In the Olivet Discourse in Luke's account, he also includes that the distress of nations with perplexity, speaking to the rising global geopolitical conflict and crises that would ensue. That the sea and the waves, speaking of the cultural collapse, moral crisis of the nations, would happen. That the signs in the heavens, that the cosmic signs would ramp up. Paul writes in 2 Timothy 3 that men would be lovers of themselves, and he has a laundry list of things speaking about the attitude of people at the end, that these would be perilous times, and they are very perilous times. There's not anywhere you can go in the world now where there is not the threat of violence being done against you by somebody. There was a street preacher in Glendale, I believe, Utah or Arizona, I'm not sure which, was shot just for preaching on the street. Peter writes in 2 Peter 3 that there would be scoffers, scoffing that we were in the last days. Certainly, I've seen my fair share of scoffers out there, people that primarily preterists or atheists, both saying, "Oh, that stuff that all happened in the first century. There's nothing to see here, nothing to see here. The world's just going to keep going on until the end, and blah blah blah." And they take prophecy and they just make a mockery of it, right? But all of this convergence isn't just coincidental. It is intentional. It is purposeful. There is an agenda. Now, I listed in here this statistic from J. Barton Payne's Encyclopedia of Bible Prophecy, and he states that there are 31,103 verses in the Bible. Out of those 31,103 verses, there are 8,352 prophetic verses in the Bible, of which 6,312 have already happened in 522 different events. For example, there are over 300 verses about Christ's coming. This leaves 2,040 verses, 215 of which are about Christ's return, that have still yet to happen. These are the events that we're waiting to see, or we're watching be fulfilled today. speaking of that, in my notes here, this is the example I have here, where all the passages, associated passages with each of those subjects. And if you, I believe, if you go to my website on the conferences tab, there's these slides are already there. So if you guys want to take the screenshot, you can, or you can actually go to that passage and get it there. I think you can screenshot each of the slides there too. Now, we know that this is intentional. Why? Because the Bible tells us this is intentional. We know that there is one final kingdom coming of within the realm of man, right? And it's the trifold nature of the kingdom of the beast, which means that there's going to be global government, global religion, and global economy. And all of these things that we're seeing today is driving the world, goose stepping the world, frog marching, whatever you want to call it, the world into this final variation of this kingdom that will ultimately be pitted against Christ himself. Now, this slide I had done as a build slide. So when I started out, you would just have a blank here. It was all blank. And then I would be talking through each of the lines, like 1, 2, 3. So this slide is basically what I wanted to highlight here is you have the world of today versus the world of Revelation 13. So I started in the year 1900, the world's population was 2 billion. And then by the year 2023, the world's population is a little over 8 billion right now. Now, I broke these up into different categories to kind of highlight how we are moving from the world that was then to the world that the uh, book of Revelation, chapter 13, speaks of, and how we are being, each of these things is pressing us towards those things in a very systematic way. And although these things don't seem connected, a lot of ways don't seem connected, they are. They are Satan's grand scheme is to ultimately go back to bring the world back to this state right here, the trifold nature: global government, global religion, and global economy. So here we have, let me go through some of these real quick because some of them may not make sense to people. Now, before 1900, we have what we would call the pre-industrial age, pre-industrial revolution, or the second industrial revolution. You had in terms of the governments in the world, you had a mixture of empires. You had the British, the French, the Austro-Hungarian, the Belgian, the Ottoman Turks, etc., the Chinese. You had monarchies, you had sovereign nation states, and there was a great belief that capitalism could end war because you're in the midst of this second industrial revolution where things are beginning to be mass produced. And the belief back then was that nations that are in business together won't go to war against each other because it's not good for business, right? Obviously, World War One to completely turn that view on its head. Within Christianity, prior to 1900, at least say prior to World War One, fundamentalism was the predominant position within American Christianity. And then we see that later splintering into modernism, evangelicalism, and liberalism. And at that time, Israel existed only in the history books. However, dispensationalists and other biblical literates believed she would come back as a nation to fulfill Bible prophecy. There is numerous writers, dispensational writers that, for instance, Clarence Larkin in his book on dispensationalism said that Israel had to become a nation again, and he published that book, I believe, in 1919. C.I. Scofield, in his translation of the Bible, wrote that Israel would become a nation again, and he did that much earlier, years earlier from that. There's another gentleman, I think his last name was Blackstone. He also wrote about Christ coming, the second coming, the tribulation, all that kind of stuff. And he said that Israel had to become a nation again. And that was in, I believe, the 1870s. So within the dispensational camp, I believe we were one of the only groups, and there may have been other Christians at the time who believed this, but this was really kind of loudly championed within dispensational groups that Israel had to become a nation again. So uh, the world at writ large, Israel existed only in the history books, and there was never going to be an Israel again. That was just kind of everybody's view on that. But yet we see the events that I mentioned earlier, World War I and World War II, that allowed for Israel to become a nation again. Amidst every different form of opposition, she came back in, and within a day she was born. As that passage says in Ezekiel, or excuse me, in Isaiah, I think it's 65. Can a nation be born in a day? Well, they were born in a day. And then, so what I have here, I've got the world crisis. Now, these aren't meant to be literally chronological, as in by decades or anything like that. They're just kind of how they happen and the coinciding events that kind of paralleled or came out of those events. So like at World War One, out of World War One, we had the League of Nations. You had within a few years the Great Depression. Um, One of the things about World War One was interesting is that they from a military standpoint, there was a saying that men rode into World War One on horses and came out on the other side in tanks and planes. And so there was the nature of that warfare, and the fact that they're in the second industrial revolution allowed for the production of things such as planes and tanks, and also the Wright brothers having uh, did perfected manned flight, I guess, in 1903. So planes were becoming a thing, but they began to be weaponized in World War One, and so we have the birth of what we'd call modern warfare, because we know the Germans introduced chemical warfare in the trenches there. There's just a whole lot of things that came out of World War One that really revolutionized warfare. And in Christendom, we're starting to see a shift away from fundamentalism to what we would call modernism. And then there, 1917 thereabouts, you have the Balfour Declaration. And between 1917 and 1921, the San Remo Conference is really kind of the establishment of the British mandate over what was then known as Palestine. But in Palestine, you had Palestinian Jews and you had Palestinian Arabs. There weren't a people called Palestinians. You were either Palestinian Jew or Palestinian Arab, um, and that was simply because of the region you lived in. Now, out of World War II, you had the creation of the United Nations. Out of that, somewhere I think 1944, you had the Bretton Woods Agreement, because the United States was the strongest nation still standing at the end of all that. We began to set the terms, financially speaking, for the global economy. That all reserve currencies, the reserve currency for the world would be U.S. dollars, and so on and so forth. And we also had, within technology, atomic warfare was established. And if you haven't seen, I guess the movie just came out not too long ago, the Oppenheimer, talking about the birth of the atomic bomb. But that was established in the United States. And pretty soon, within a few years, you'd start to see this technology begin to spread amongst the other world powers. In Christendom, and particularly with regards to the United Nations, there's this huge interfaith movement that's coming out of the United Nations. And if you look at the spiritual components of the United Nations, they largely relied on, um, I'm blanking on the man and the woman's name, but they did a lot of the writing for um, the um, United Nations charters and things like that. So they were influential. Alice Bailey, I can't remember her husband's name, but she was a acolyte, or a devotee of Helena Blavatsky, who was a theosophist. So these are not Christian people. They are very much like universalist and Eastern mysticism and other things, paganism, pretending and using Christian language. They began to use the United Nations as the platform to kind of force interfaithism onto what we would call Christian peoples of the world. At around the same time, 1947, the United Nations votes to um, allow for there to be a partitioning of a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, or an Arab state. And that Palestinian Arab state is what we would call Transjordan today, or they're called Jordan, but back then it was called Transjordan. And up until that point, Israel, what we would call Israel pre 1967, was under the Jewish mandate, or under the British mandate. And then afterwards, after they became a nation again, they immediately went into war. We'll see that here in a second. But After World War II, you have the next major kind of conflict is the beginning of the Cold War as the Soviet Union begins to clamp down on Eastern Europe and claim everything, from Berlin east, um, as their territory, their right. The Russians or the Soviets at the time had suffered just tremendous loss. I mean, upwards of like I think 40 million Russians had been killed in World War II, and they wanted to be recompensed or recompensed. I don't think that's the right word. Compensated for their losses and their grievances by the Germans. And so basically, we see the beginning of what would become the Iron Curtain that would be uh, placed, blocking Eastern Europe off from Western Europe, and beginning of the era of the Cold War. And out of the Cold War came NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, where U.S. and Western European nations agreed to this military alliance in order to curb or to stave off the threat from the Soviet Union. At also around the same time, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund is created. We have the arms race now that atomic warfare is beginning to be that technology. That genie was out of the bottle at that point, and other nations were beginning to acquire this technology. Um, you had within Christianity evangelicalism, which um, begins to open up to a much broader audience within Christendom. And then you can think about, say, the beginnings of like the Billy Graham Crusades and things like that. With that, 1949, the Knesset's formed. You have the next thing is the Red Scare in the 1950s. You have the end of colonialism with a lot of European countries, the creation of the Bilderberger organization, which was a meeting held between the most powerful who's who of governments and corporations and the media, all meeting secretly behind closed doors. Pretty much kind of dictating how the world was going to go in the next year and what their aims were for achieving, whatever it is they were trying to achieve back in the 50s. But uh, it was Chatham House rules. Basically, you could attend if you were invited, but you couldn't write anything down. You couldn't attribute any quotes to anybody. You couldn't take photographs, etc. It was very hush hush, and that those meetings still happen to this day. And it's the who's who of the movers and shakers in the world, basically trying to dictate or saying what where they want the world to be in the next year. And these aren't necessarily elected folks. Some of them are private citizens in different corporations in financial institutions and things like that, but they're also driving how we're going to live for the next year. You have the space race between the Soviets and Americans. You have within Christianity, I call it mass marketing, but really these big campaigns, Billy Graham type crusades and other crusades that were going on, where you're trying to reach this mass audience, these big stadiums and things like that. But you also have within Christianity the new platforms that are coming out. So you had radio before, but now you have television. And so now television is, a lot of these ministries are starting to take to the airwaves to begin to preach on TV, and they begin to attract audiences and so forth that way. And then you have the crisis in I think 1956 with the Suez Canal, where this kind of dust up between Britain and Egypt and the U.S. and Israel over control of the Suez Canal. I think the Egyptians were going to nationalize the Suez Canal. And then here, number four, excuse me, throat's getting dry. You have the Red Scare. Okay. I think this was the same point in, excuse me, when I was at the conference. I was like, my throat just like dried up really bad. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna get some water. Yeah. Yeah. So, all right, I'm back. The Red Scare, the end of colonialism. Where am I at? I'm number 5. Organized crime. So the reason I listed organized crime was that as criminals became more violent and more um, deceptive in how they were executing their various forms of crime, it forced, or a forcing function of that forced law enforcement to also match and then beat their levels of crime and sophistication. We start to see the rise of the militarization of law enforcement primarily because organized crime forced it to become that way. If you think back to like most small towns in America had, I want to say exactly like an Andy Griffith, Barney Fife, you know, law enforcement set up in their towns, but something similar to that. It wasn't very complex. It was, mostly drunk and disorderly was kind of the big thing. But as organized crime began to take advantage of people in various ways, it forced law enforcement to militarize. And Mayberry, thank you, to step up their game. And now, basically, the police forces is across the United States are absolutely militarized. And so, and they had to be to compete, keep up with the race against organized crime. Now, back in the, say, the 40s through the 70s, or even the early 80s, you had the big Cosa Nostra, the mafia. But now, I guess from the 80s onward, you had, gangs, inner city gangs, you had biker gangs, you had nowadays, because of the war on drugs, basically decimated the drug kingpins in Colombia. All of those drug lords moved up into Mexico, so now we're facing the cartels. Just south of the border, that are causing all kinds of havoc and wreaking all kind of havoc in the United States. And so organized crime has been one of those things, is forcing law enforcement to continually militarize and become more heavy-handed when it comes to dealing with everybody else. We have in the 70s the Trilateral Commission. We got off the gold standard under Nixon, simply because we realized that you can't fund this Great Society initiatives that LBJ had set forth, basically creating a welfare state, and fight this very costly, expensive land war in Vietnam at the same time. And so basically that drove us off the gold standard. We couldn't sustain that anymore. And now we went to a debt-based, free-floating fiat currency that has been the standard ever since. Within technology, you have the automation of things that are beginning to take place within various industries. Within Christendom, you start to see Christendom being affected or impacted by the counterculture movement of the late 60s and in 70s. Obviously, in the 60s, you had the 6 Day War, where Israel, against all odds, defeated their enemies. I guess like 4 or 5 nations that came against them. You have the onset in the 70s of terrorism, particularly one of the most well-known cases. I think it was the 1973 Olympics, or 74 Olympics, with the Black, I think it's Black September or Black October organization. They're Palestinian Arabs who killed those Israeli Olympic athletes there in Munich, Germany. We start to see the formation of the European Union. Now, the European Union the formation had begun back in the 50s, when they start having all these different treaties coming out, the Treaty of Paris, Treaty of Rome, et cetera, et cetera. All these different treaties begin to solidify different parts of what would eventually become the European Union. But we're starting to see this process taking shape, and now people are beginning to talk about it, Europe being united under one banner. We have the creation of the petrodollar, thanks to the Yom Kippur War and the U.S. support of that. The Arabs boycotted selling Americans or the West any oil, which created all kind of havoc in the West. But it also was a forcing function for a lot of automobile industries to get off these gas guzzlers and explored drilling in the United States and so on and so forth. But one of the things that came out of that, the deals there, was the creation of the petrodollar. In that, we would guarantee. I don't know if it was all the OPEC nations or just Saudi Arabia or the seven kingdoms there in that particular area, um, military support in exchange that they would make all their oil transactions in dollars. And so we see this come to fruition later in the Gulf War. But technology, we see the internet starting to come about. It began in military laboratories, science complexes, and things like that, where inter office communication was taking place, and then it kind of went to some universities. But here is, the birth of the internet starting to become a thing, even though it's in a very small, specialized communities that this is taking place. They see the potential for it. Christendom is being impacted by Eastern mysticism, which had come over, or not come over, but had been popularized in large part by the Beatles, for instance. When the Beatles came back from their trips to India, praising all these different gurus and speaking about the greatness of Hinduism, etc. We start to see this kind of come out into popular culture with the Hare Krishna movement, the Baha'i, not Baha'i faith, but the different facets of Hinduism begin to spread within pop culture. And but I think it was really popularized by the Beatles when they went over there and came back. Obviously, the Beach Boys did the same thing. And we have the Yom Kippur War that I mentioned early on. And then in the late 70s and going into the 80s, we start to see that the environment is now becoming the big crisis for the world. At first in the 70s, it was global cooling. You have Time magazine and these other saying, hey, the world's going to freeze over. And then in the 80s, we start to see that narrative shift to global warming. Obviously, that carried all the way through the 90s and the early 2000s with Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. But going back to, say, 1993, we started to see the genesis for the War on Terror with the World Trade Center bombings that took place, I guess, in the basement or the garage or whatever there. And then we have in 1995 the Oklahoma City bombing. And if you wonder where the Patriot Act came from, it came from the omnibus bill that I think Tom Daschle and Joe Biden wrote back somewhere around the time frame of 1995. I think it was before the Oklahoma City bombings, and they couldn't get it passed because it was too it was too unconstitutional. I mean, like, it violated all sorts of things. But we start to see this as I think the Oklahoma City bombing was kind of the first big wake up for people, like, whoa, this can happen here. And we see by 2001, 9/11, that omnibus bill that Biden and Daschle had written had been tweaked, and had been updated, but basically remained in its original form in terms of what it was hoping to achieve. And that was what the Patriot Act was, and that's how they were able to pass it 30 days after 9/11. By the late October of 2001, that became law. And I think the only guy that voted against it was the Libertarian guy. His son's in the Senate now. Ron something. Anyways, yeah, bad deal. We start to see in the global economy that currency is being diversified between, and I call this the diversification. But say prior to the 60s, everything was kind of cash. And then you start seeing checks in the late 60s, early 70s. And then we see the advent of credit cards in the late 80s, mid to late 80s. And then they were starting to see different forms of currency kind of beginning to proliferate throughout the world. not that there's other different forms of currency. Obviously, every nation had its own forms of currency, but how you use that currency and how you pay for things begin to diversify. And so even now into the early 2000s, we start to hear about cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, um, now debit cards. I mean, you can pay on your phone, pay with your eyeball, pay with your hand. I mean, like there's just so many different ways to pay for things now. It's really crazy. We have probably in the late 90s, the really the kind of the realization of artificial intelligence. Yeah, Ron Paul, thank you. And artificial intelligence really began to take off in the late 90s. Although the AI in its very basic forms had existed even as far back as the 1950s. But in the late 90s, it was really starting to take off. Within Christendom, you start to see the ecumenical movements happening within different branches of Christianity. Now, when I grew up, one example of this, it may not be the best example, but is an example. Um, I lived in a small town, and you had your Methodist church, you had multiple Baptist churches, you had your Catholic church, you had maybe a Latter-day Saint temple or whatever, or church, whatever they call them. You had Presbyterians, you had Episcopalians, etc. But then it seems like from the 2000s on, things begin to really splinter and fracture within different denominations, and now there's so many different kinds of even just Methodist or most churches now. I would say the majority of churches in any town is like a non-denominational church. They used to be Baptist or they used to be something else, and they broke away from them, and so you start to see this blending of different things. And I'm not saying that it's all bad. I think that there are conservative or evangelical Lutherans that broke away from the main Lutheran denomination because of their support for like gay marriage and other things. And they just like, hey, we're Lutheran, but we don't want any part of that. Same thing with all the other branches and other denominations that are now beginning to splinter and then merge together. And you start seeing this kind of blending of everything. And it largely takes shape in a lot of these non-denominational churches that don't have a clear statement of faith, but typically follow some kind of seeker-sensitive kind of platform of bringing people in. So, anyways, I think the danger within non-denominational churches is that if you don't have a clear statement of faith, you don't have a clear delineation of what makes you unique, as opposed to the next denominational church down the road. If you don't have that set in stone, then you're kind of subject um, uh, to whatever whims come, right? If you're a Baptist church or Southern Baptist and you say, I'm a Southern Baptist church, I'm starting a Southern Baptist church here in this town, planting a Southern Baptist church here, you have to follow the guidelines of the Southern Baptist Convention as the hierarchy in order to call your church that. Now, I'm not saying that the Southern Baptist Convention is perfect, or the people running it are perfect. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying if you identify as that, it used to be you had to follow certain beliefs. One of some of those beliefs is the essentials of the faith, right? That Christ is God come in the flesh, that he was he's born of a virgin, lived a sinless life, was crucified, buried, rose again on the third day. The inerrancy of Scripture, the triune nature of God, those kind of things. But now, when you move everything into non-denominational and your statement of faith becomes very wishy-washy, or it's not even there at all on any of your home pages or anything where you can find about what does this church stand for, your belief systems now become very subjective, and then subject to whoever's leading that church and whatever they believe. So you may have a very conservative pastor at the time, but then he retires and some young guy takes over and he takes the church in a completely different direction. So those people leave out of that church, form another church. It's just kind of a hot mess now. Queen of props. My experience of non-denominational churches that they do have a statement of faith. I have found a lot that don't. I drive down the road and I'll see there's probably in this town I live in, I guess there's about 5 or 6 that are I would consider non-denominational. And I have no idea what they believe. You go to their website, no There might be some kind of vague, um, hey, we're Christian, we believe in Jesus kind of thing, but when you start drilling into the specifics of things, it's hard to nail down what they believe. Okay, obviously this goes back to 1977 with the Camp David Accords under Carter and um, I can't remember the guy's name, Begin, and then the Egyptian, I don't, it's not Yasser Arafat, it's anyways, Land for Peace began then, and it basically went from 1977 to about 2017. And so then the next big crisis here in the last just few years has been UFOs, disclosure. Now, granted, this is not a crisis, existential crisis just yet. I think that this is going to continue. I think what we've seen thus far with regards to the congressional hearings and the Senate hearings, and the Pentagon's disclosure on their involvement in studying these things and the history going back to Roswell in 47. All of these things, I think, are going to come to a head. I don't think they're just happening arbitrarily. I think that this is prefacing what will come as an explanation for the rapture. And I think at the rapture, they're going to see signs and wonders like crazy, and it's going to look like UFOs have invaded. Now, that's the only reason I can make sense of why disclosure, why now, why as of say 2017, 2018, why is the government all of a sudden talking about something that's been an issue going back to the late 1940s? And the only thing I can think of is that it's been building to this point for a specific reason, and that reason is to deceive people at the point of rapture, that it was not Christ that took his church home, it was these other things. That's the only thing that makes sense to my mind. Why disclosure and why now, right? We see the global government on steroids forming, and there is this great push for the Great Reset, and they want to do this by 2030, and that time is ramping up even faster and faster the closer we get to it. Across the global economy, we're starting to see that biometric digital technology is really kind of taken off in places, particularly in places like Europe and China, where you're no longer needing to carry any kind of ID or currency or anything around. You just pay with your eyeball, pay with your hand, facial recognition, whatever the case is. You walk in, or you have a chip in your hand, you walk into a store, it automatically registers your account and deducts the things that you take off the shelves and walk out of the store with. That is happening, and that's going to continue to ramp up, because ultimately we see that happening inside the 70th week. As far as technology goes, I don't think that the kingdom of the beast is going to be able to function as efficiently as it wants to unless quantum becomes the main system that they use to run everything. Because you got to think about what is Revelation 13. What is it when you boil it all down to four things? What is it talking about? It's talking about absolute globalism, and that will probably come about through regionalism. Those regions will then be lumped together and basically form one global government, the 10 kings, right? You will have absolute, you have a global economy. It's going to be an absolute global economy that everybody's under one paying system. You're going to have, and that's for controlling everything, right? Then you're going to have absolute loyalty, and that loyalty is enforced through worship. So the mark is not just something that you use to pay for things. When you take it, it's like taking getting a tattoo of a swastika on your hand. Like, you're forever marking yourself as identifying with this group, right? This is something that's going to change you. How much it changes people, to what extent, we don't necessarily know just yet, because we don't know all the impacts of what the mark of the beast is going to be and what it's going to do to the human body. But the Bible says that if you take it, you're damned, right? You're damned forever. Now, the last part of this, the fourth part, is going to be the supernatural. The supernatural is going to be used to reinforce all of the other three things: the globalism, the global economy, and the loyalty to the kingdom of the beast, they're going to be able to do things that will seem, these lying signs and wonders that are going to seem supernatural. And one thing I wanted to bring up, um, that's not necessarily, I was using this for the cutting edge article, or the bleeding edge article I'm writing. But one of the things I wanted to talk about as a sidebar was when the false prophet is able to call down fire from heaven, the way it's described in Revelation 13. And it made me think of Maui. It made me think of these directed energy weapons. And if he is somehow linked with this mark in his forehead or whatever to some satellite up there that has, he can direct where and when this directed energy weapon is going to hit. He can call down fire from uh, from space. And but here, if you contrast that with the two witnesses, they are not only able to call down fire from God from heaven, that it's a streak of fire. They're also able to shoot fire out of their mouths. When people trying to attack them, they can just like open their mouth and fire shoots out. So maybe that's part of the lying signs and wonders. I don't know, but I think quantum systems will be absolutely necessary to be able to handle the amount of information processing that is going to be required to control everybody on the planet. Within church Christendom, you have what we call postmodernism, and I think most churches today are wrestling with all of this, with it, whether they're talking about their acceptance of the alphabet mafia, whether their positions on Israel, their positions on truth, on who Jesus is, like even the basic stuff. Like there's, I forget the Barnaples that are out now, but like, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 40% of pastors don't even necessarily believe the Bible is true, or that Jesus is the only way to salvation. It's something crazy like that. And I think that's just endemic of the times that we're in, that people, we live in this postmodern age where nobody can know anything, can know truth anymore. Truth is no longer exclusive or objective, and now it's subjective to everybody's kind of personal opinions. Um, and then the last part here with Israel is the Abraham Accords. So what do all these mean, right? These are all the things we've seen from the year 1900 forward, and it seems like we're being marched kind of step by step into this world of Revelation 13. So the next world crisis is going to be the rapture. Now let's I want to stop here for a second. Let's say that in the Bible, hypothetically, let's say in the Bible that Christians aren't raptured into the sky, that we would be raptured into like the ocean or sucked into the ground or something, something other than just being caught up into the sky. Would UFOs in this disclosure, would they even be a thing? I don't think they would be a thing. I think wherever Satan is going to use that distraction is going to be, that distraction has got to be natural or native to the place of our ascendancy. So because we're going to be caught up into the skies to meet the Lord in the air, that is where the deception is going to be taking place. As Paul alludes to Satan as the prince of the power of the air. That is why we see UFOs in the sky, and that's all this crazy stuff that's happening in the skies. And maybe 7 times out of 10, it's a weather balloon or it's some other thing that can be explained. But there's a lot of times where it cannot be explained. And there's a growing number of things that cannot be explained that are happening in the heavens. And so if the rapture were to take place some other place, to some other medium, like if we were going to be, caught away into the ocean and through the ocean to another dimension, the deception would be taking place over there in the waters. Or if it's in the ground, it would be in the ground. Satan would be playing this up to whatever place that our deliverance was going to be to. That's where he would focus his deception on. That's why I think the UFO, the disclosures, and all that stuff is happening with intensity, increasing in frequency and intensity, to the point that the government now has to finally address it publicly, and then devote money and resources and manpower to studying this problem that I think is going to continue to ramp up until the moment of the rapture. Now, in terms of the global government, I think Ty Green and others have talked about the BRICS nations as being possibly the 10 kings. I honestly, I don't know. I think he's got some good points there. But whether they are or they aren't, I think when the rapture happens, and I think because it collapses the United States, because the United States is already on the razor's edge, if as it were, with regards to how fragile our economy and stuff is. If you were to throw any kind of major crisis on the U.S. right now, it could collapse us. And I think that when you remove, say, even 10% of the American population instantaneously, and it's probably going to be more than that, that will collapse the United States. And as the United States collapses, it will drag down the global economy, which is why you see other nations beginning to divest themselves from the American dollar and from American debt and from American strings being in their pockets and stuff. That's why they're moving away from the United States. But if it were to happen, it is going to force a geopolitical realignment in the world, like that we haven't seen since the collapse of the Roman Empire, probably. Now, out of that global realignment, I think this is where we see the 10 kings arise, and how they arise, who they are, etc. I'd have no idea. I just think that it makes sense that instead of becoming instantly global government, it would be regional government and then global. That gets incorporated as the Antichrist begins to rise to power, and he takes over three of the kings, or subdues three kings, and now he has the majority. And now he's able to set the terms and conditions for everybody else. Now, obviously, we would see an economic collapse, which would necessitate, if the U.S. dollar collapses, and it is still as shaky as it is, it's still the kind of the reserve currency in the world. Even the dollar collapses after the rapture of the church. I believe this is what necessitates not only the geopolitical realignment, but also the economic realignment to what will become the mark of the beast down the road. We see that technology has moved from very rudimentary to the atomic, to space, to automation, the internet, etc. Where we're going to see the technology, the last frontier, as it were, is going to be into the human body. It is going to be in embedding technology into the human body. The NSA and the CIA have discovered long time ago the US that the average person, the average body, has the capacity to hold, I don't even know, petabytes of information in just your fingertip. Like, your DNA is information storage. The double helix thing, when you think of your DNA, all that is information storage. It determines how tall you're going to be, what color hair you're going to have, what diseases you're prone to having or inherited from a past ancestor, so on. But there's also tons of storage space inside of the human body. So between that and the Neuralink and Starlink and all the different kinds of things that they're trying to get into the human body, I think that this is how the mark of the beast comes about in some way. And then that's tied in with a quantum system that's able to handle that information processing, and tie that in with artificial intelligence and these other things. It's going to be a terrifying time to be alive for the average person who's now being thrust into this world where you either take this mark and damn your soul for all eternity, or you don't take the mark and you lose your head, or you're cut out from society. And I was watching a guy speak on RT, Russian Times TV. This was years ago when this guy spoke, and he was talking about that in the future they won't even need prisons. All they have to do is lock you out of society to where you can't buy or sell, and that's the way everything is moving in this time frame. And you will basically starve to death, and you will be cut out from all medical services, all food, all you can't buy or rent, you can't pay for gas. I mean, you won't have nothing. You were completely shunned in a society without the mark. And so I think that as Christians, as those that are watching, and we are storing water and food and resources, we store it for a rainy day, right? We're not necessarily prepping to prep, but if you prepare for losing power, or going without electricity or something, or some kind of natural phenomena that happens. I think that's prudent for us, but I also think that there is, if and when the rapture happens, because Christians are kind of thinking this way, that immediately after the rapture, that our houses will be ransacked, and people will be taking, presumably your expensive stuff, jewelry, laptops, and things. But I think later on, people are going to start coming and scavenging for food, as times get hard. And so, uh, the last thing here, once the church is removed, what is going to be left over is what is apostate, what is the those people that Christ said, "I never knew you." This is the left behind church, who were Christian in name only. Now, I will say that there is going to be this massive revival. I don't want to call it a revival, but there's a massive soul harvest after the rapture, where people are going to understand what just took place, and it's going to hit them hard, and they're going to repent and come to the faith in Christ. And I think a lot of these people would be in churches who are at least familiar with the rapture as an idea. They may not have believed it, but because their pastor never talked about it, or because it was never anything that they were ever exposed to in any real sense of the word. But they will know what it is, and I think there will be a huge soul harvest at the end of this. But it's gonna be too late. Whatever the system is, the church system that's left behind will be this apostate system that will be all wrapped up into one big giant ecumenical swampy soup that becomes the whore of Babylon, right? And then the whore of Babylon, that this global ecumenical religious system that ties in Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism, New Age mysticism, Eastern mysticism, all this thing is just going to come together. There is no truth. All of that stuff will eventually, at the midpoint, is going to be that worship is going to then be directed away from the whore to this man Antichrist, who they're going to say is God come in the flesh, and people are going to worship him as God. And so this is that apostate system that is left behind. And then the last thing is this covenant with death. Now, we know that this is a lot of confusion. I know this is in Isaiah 28. I don't know if this is speaking of the Abraham Accords. I don't know if this is speaking of some future covenant that we see in Daniel 9:27. Whatever the covenant is, I believe it's probably Daniel 9:27. But whatever that covenant becomes, or comes out of, or maybe it is part of the Abraham Accords, or it's part of some other thing we see now, but it won't find its fulfillment until that time after the rapture. That is what starts the 70th week. Whenever and whatever that covenant is, that is what starts that 70th week. So here in the world crisis, you see, I put into there Revelation 13:1. It says, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw the beast rising up out of the sea." This is this global government that's coming up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his 10 and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. So the heads representing um, seats of power, the horns representing authority, and then the crowns being these rulers, right? And we see the explanation of this in Revelation 17. And then at the end of Revelation 13, he causes all, speaking of the false prophet, he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So we don't know what that 666 stands for just yet. We know that the number of man is 6. He was created on the 6th day, and we see the kind of correlations in the throughout the scripture regarding the number 6 and man. We know that in Solomon, somewhere with dealing with Solomon, he was paid 666 pieces. The statue of Nebuchadnezzar was like 60 feet high, 6 feet wide, and they had 6 instruments. We see these correlations throughout scripture, speaking of what's going to come here. I don't know what that number is. I don't know what the guy's name is. I'm not even pretend to know. We just know that he is coming and that somehow his number and his name correlates with 666. So, all right. This is, I think, the last slide, or second to the last slide. What I was trying to explain here is that you see in 1900 the convergence beginning. You see in 1948 Israel becomes a nation again. Now you're starting to see this convergence of both of these two prophetic points, one of which is convergence of all the other signs. And it seems like we're there. We're there at the end, where the end point is vanished, and we're waiting for is to be taken up. So, with that said, when going back to what Jesus says in Luke 21:28, now when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads because your redemption draws near. So we know that our redemption is drawing near. Every second that we're here, it's drawing that much closer. So if you don't know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you do not want to be here when after the rapture takes place. It is going to happen. I don't care if it sounds foolish or not. It sounds foolish on the face of it, but it's going to absolutely happen. And there's a lot of things that sounded foolish until they happened. The flood sounded foolish until it started to rain. Moses looked foolish when he led the Israelites to the Red Sea until God parted the waters. All of these things throughout Scripture, it looks foolish to the world, but then it happens, and then the world's trying to like deal with the fallout from it, right? So that said, that was the end of my presentation. And I did all that in like 50 minutes. So I was having to talk really fast. I had time here to kind of expound on ideas and think through things and talk about stuff. And I don't know where I'm at right now, almost 2 hours. So I think I spent the first 10 minutes kind of just going over administrative stuff. But anyway, so let me go to some questions, and then I got to bug out of here so I can get my kids and finish cleaning the house and get ready for this afternoon. Let me see if I can find my Telegram. And sorry, I was losing my voice earlier. Okay. Can you, Anita writes, can you expound on God creating evil? That's one of those really kind of fundamental questions of why did God allow Satan to exist or something. Um, I would just say that in order for God to, and I'm not going to speak for why he created Satan or Lucifer, who he knew would become Satan down the road, but in order for there to be true love, um, there has to be free will. There has to be the ability to exercise whether to love or not love. And so if we're looking at the existence of evil, God did not create evil. God gave man free will to choose, rather than if God was going to create everybody to be automatons and everybody think the same way, then there would be no real true love in the sense that we really love God and worship him and serve him because of his goodness and his mercy and all that. But without free will, we wouldn't have that ability. So I don't pretend to even understand why he created Satan, but I do know that angels were created with, I think, the same ability for free will. There was no way for them to be redeemed. There was no pathway for their redemption for them. That redemption pathway was only for mankind. So when angels fell and they sided with Lucifer, when Lucifer sinned because of his pride, there was no way to redeem them. So they're damned and they're doomed forever. And they that's why they war against us so viciously. Okay, is Elon the peace agreement broker? He is in Israel. Elon keeps popping back up, and he's a very interesting guy. I don't know. I don't think he is a peace agreement broker. I think that each of the nations, when it comes to if we're talking about the hostages, the Thai nation, the Thai government worked through Qatar or Iran to negotiate the release of the Thai citizens that were captured by Hamas. The Russians did it for their Russian citizen. Um, I think those were the only. I'm not sure of all the foreigners that were released in this, but I think those governments, their ambassadors and so forth, negotiated to get those citizens released. But he is in Israel. He's looking at everything, and he is very much an interesting cat in regards to at least one of the possibly the 10 kings. And I'm of the belief that if his Starlink system is connected with the Neuralink system, which I guess it could be in some way, shape, or form, then he would be an interesting guy to watch going forward. Okay, so what do you think is the sin unto death, and why do we not pray for it? 1 John 5:16. I want to look that up. First John 5:16. Somebody wanted some music while I was looking for stuff. Let me start in 13. These things I've written to you who believe in the name of Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life, and that you may continue to believe in the name of the Son of God. Now, this is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he will hear us. And if we know that he hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have the petitions that we have asked of him. If anyone sees his brother sinning a sin which does not lead to death, he will ask, and he will give him life for those who commit sin not leading to death. If anyone sees his brother sinning a sin which does not lead to death, excuse me, he will ask, and he will give him life for those. So if anyone sees his brother sinning a sin which does not lead to death, he, the person asking for the prayer, will ask, and he, Jesus, will give him life for those who commit sin not leading to death. There is a sin leading to death, and I do not say that he should pray about that. All unrighteousness is sin, and there is sin not leading to death. We know that whoever is born of God does not sin, but he who has been born of God keeps himself, and the wicked one does not touch him. We know that we are of God, and the whole world lies under the sway of the wicked one. I guess in at looking at it a different way, is the only unforgivable sin is to blaspheme the Holy Spirit, and you blaspheme the Holy Spirit by refusing his call and dying in your sins. So I think that every person that will ever stand before the judgment seat of God at the great white throne judgment will be without excuse. They will have had made a conscious decision to reject Jesus Christ. Now, the sin not leading to death, we know that anything that is not per God's will can be construed as a sin. So there's sins of omission, that those are the sins that we don't, the things that we should do but we don't, and then things of commission, the things we shouldn't do but we do. And there's sins in the thoughts, and what we think. Jesus said that adultery is not just sleeping with another woman, that's not your wife, but it's also lusting after somebody. Murder was not just physically killing somebody, but it was hating your brother. I mean, so there's these sins like that, but then there's other sins that have very great penalties for doing them and living those things. Homosexual lifestyles, um, you know, the propensity to catch AIDS or any other number of things is. I mean, if you look at the statistics, I mean, it's way, 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 way out there, way above just your normal traditional heterosexual monogamous marriage kind of thing. The that culture just in and of itself is very hedonistic. So the propensity to sleep around and do things, you know, without a care is been very costly to the homosexual community, especially from the 1980s regards to AIDS and all the other things that are happening. So you know, I don't know what that specific sin is not leading to death versus the one leading to death, other than living a particular lifestyle that causes you to physically die in or destroy yourself. So, Mhm. All right. Let's see. It's 2:07 right now. Do you think the war in heaven has happened? Some as saying it did based on October 7th attack on Israel. No, I don't think it's happened yet. I don't think that happens till the midpoint. Do you think the war in heaven has okay, I read that one. What is the epistle? Or here's the reason why I don't think that's happened yet. Because at the midpoint, I believe Satan is cast out and he no longer it's not that he doesn't have access to heaven. He doesn't have access to that realm, to that dimension, the divine eternal dimension anymore. He's physically constrained to the earth just like we are. And that's where he comes down with great fury and wrath. And so I think it's at that midpoint where he's finally he's cut off. He can't go in. He can't go there anymore. Not just him, but all of the fallen angels, etc. What is the epistle that Paul was talking about sharing towards the end of Colossians? What is the epistle to Laodicea? Colossians 4:16. Let's see. Colossians. All right, 4:16. Now, when you see this, or now when this epistle is read among you, see that it is read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea. We don't know, other than to say that I think Ken Johnson was saying, if I remember correctly, he was saying that he believed there was, I guess there was a third Corinthians. I can't remember. I'm maybe misquoting him here, but the I'm positive that Paul wrote more than just this. I think he wrote pretty prolifically, and there's probably all sorts of letters and things that were not included in this in what we would call the canon of Scripture. And let's just say hypothetically that there was a third Corinthians and we found it. I don't know that that is something that we would include in the Bible because God, if God wanted to have included it, He would have included it. You know, He would have had that for the last 2,000 years. So I want to say it was Ken Johnson that mentioned something about Third Corinthians, but I can't remember it. But I'm sure there was a epistle to the Laodiceans. And when I look at the seven letters to the seven churches, obviously, um, I see the correlation that with the seven letters to the seven churches, you also have seven letters from Paul to the churches, and then seven mystery kingdom parables, Matthew 13. So Paul wrote to seven churches. He wrote to the Romans, the Ephesians, Colossians, Corinthians, Thessalonians, the Galatians, and the Philippians. Now, I also believe Paul wrote Hebrews, but he doesn't sign. Nobody signs the book of Hebrews. Nobody appears as the author, and I think that's intentional. So it ends up being that Paul wrote seven letters to seven churches because we can't definitively. You can hear my dogs going nuts in the background. You can't definitively hear or you can't definitively say that Paul wrote to the letter of the Hebrews, although most people see that there's a lot of language in there in the way he writes things and stuff. That seems very Pauline in nature. So Allison says, yes, it was Ken. Thank you. Give me 1 second, guys. Wife's calling. All right. And we're almost done here, guys. Okay, the last questions here. How will people get saved during the tribulation? Well, they're going to get saved by placing their faith and trust in Jesus Christ and the finished work on the cross. Same as we get saved. I don't know the distinctives. They're not the church, and they're not part of the church. But we know that prior to um, the prior to Acts 2, with the giving of the Holy Spirit, the Old Testament were saved. They were justified by their faith and placed in a temporary holding in what we would call paradise. And then that's when Christ, during his burial, went down to hell, which was divided between torments and paradise, and he preached to them and brought them, took captivity captive, and took them back with him. But this group, that when they die, they go underneath the throne, and they're waiting there until we see them asking the question, how much longer is this going to go on? So there seems to be a distinction between those people and the church, who's already there, going through the marriage supper of the Lamb, or preparing for it. And there's a distinction between those two groups, but the mechanism for salvation still remains the same. Okay. Oh man. Okay. There's 4 questions left. That's all the questions. Thank you, Anita. Appreciate it. Only believe. Question A. Fruchtenbaum, Footsteps of the Messiah, uses the days in Hosea 3:2 to be the literal days at the very end of the tribulation. Do you think each do you think the days each equal 1,000 years, as in 2 Peter 3:8? I read that book, and I haven't had that in years, so Hosea 3:2. I gave it away to somebody, and I wish I hadn't, because Dr. Fruchtenbaum signed it for me. One of those big regrets that I have that in my life. I wish I'd kept that book. 3:2. And the days in Hosea 3:2. Hosea 3:2. Then the Lord said to me, "Go again, love a woman who is loved by a lover and committing adultery, just like the love of the Lord for the children of Israel, who look to the other gods and love the raisin cakes of the pagans. So I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and 1.5 homers of barley." And I said to her, "You shall stay with me many days, and you shall not play the harlot, nor shall I have a man. So too will I be toward you. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, without ephod or teraphim. And afterward the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord and their God and David their king. And they shall fear the Lord and his glorious goodness in the latter days." If I'm understanding correctly, or I guess Dr. Fruchtenbaum was equating 1,500 and 1.5 as being 1,000, 1,500 years plus 100 years and then 50 years. I honestly, I have no idea. 6, 1 through 3. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay, that makes more sense. I was like 3, 1 through 2. Yeah, I believe that. Um, yeah, I absolutely believe that. The 6, 1 through 3. Or actually, you can start in verse 15 or 5:15. Um, says, "I will return again to my places," God speaking, "until they acknowledge their offense, and then they will seek my face, and in their affliction they will earnestly seek me. Come, let us return to the Lord." This is what there's Israel saying. "For he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. And on the third day he will raise us up, that we may live in his sight." I absolutely think that we're at the end of the second day. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Mrs. Mag C. Farms question: does anyone consider that Jesus' first coming was the first half of Daniel's 70 weeks, and there was only 3.5 years left for the second coming? No, because at the end of the 69th week, he was crucified, and it says that in Daniel 9:26. And it's in 9:27 that the 70th week starts with this covenant that's confirmed with the many, and that has not happened yet. So that full 7 years is still future. Annette asks, question, does anyone else think that the Lord is saying that a temple will be built before Passover 2020, so the red heifer sacrifices? No, I don't know that the temple will be rebuilt for Passover 2024. I think that they'll, if those heifers remain pure or remain without any non-red hairs, that they will be sacrificed on Passover of 2024, so April of 2024. And then at that point, they may be able to be used for the consecration of, the priest and the instruments and things like that. So I think I think that's going to happen first before anything. But to the point is, why is Israel's enemies so stirred up? Why? I mean, even before October 7th, why was Israel just in such political turmoil and so divided over these Netanyahu and the judges and all these things that were going on? They were completely in disarray. And I think it was because of these red heifers, the appearance of these things, that Satan is beginning to stir up their enemies to prevent Israel from doing this. So if that theory is correct, and the Jews end up sacrificing these red heifers, however many remain pure, on that day, then I think that's significant, and I think that could be a marker for the the third temple to begin, like a green light for them to begin construction on it. Okay, thank you, Annette. Scotty Love, question: who are the Jews that say they are not Jews and are not? Who are the Jews that say they are Jews and are not? I'm assuming this is from Revelation 2 and 3 that Jesus is referring to. But man, there's so many people today that could apply to. So you have the secular atheist, God-hating Jews that reject God altogether. There are the cessationist, the replacement theology Christians who say they are Jews or the new Jews and are not. There's cult groups, whether the Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or British Israelism or Armstrongism or all the different groups out there that claim to be the new Jews or claim to inherit all of the blessings and stuff, and now they are the chosen people. There's those people. You got the Black Hebrew movements who claim that they're the true Jew. I mean, like there's so many different that uh, it's really hard to say, to narrow it down into just one particular group. But I look at in Paul's day, Paul talks about in Romans 11:25, 26, through 27, he talks about right now they're enemies, and for the sake of the gospel, they're enemies. I mean, they hate the gospel. They hate it. They have this blindness put on them. Um, but that blindness is temporary. It's not going to last forever. But regardless, whether here's where my issue is with the church. The church did not become Israel when Israel crucified their Messiah. The church did not replace Israel. We did not inherit all the stuff from Israel. We are blessed by Israel, by our Messiah, who is Jewish and who fulfilled the law in its totality perfectly without sin. But just because we're grafted in, we don't take over the tree. We're just grafted into the tree that's already there. The branches. We're the wild olive branches. We don't take over the tree. The tree is still there. Israel is still going to be Israel. And when they finally come to the realization that Jesus is their Messiah, this is where their true Jewishness comes to its total fulfillment. And you see that today with Messianic Jews, Jews that are nationally, ethnically Jewish, who come to faith in Christ. And if you watch those One for Israel videos, or look at Mimir Sarfati and these other groups, that's that is Jewish realizing Judaism in its fulfilled manner that Christ was the fulfillment of Judaism. So I don't know. There's a lot of groups that claim to be Jews and they're not, and there's literally just you can lump them all into one group and say there's those imposters, and then there's actually the true Jews that are physically, ethically Jewish, and they also worship their Messiah. And there are those that are still under the blindness that will have that blindness lifted at the midpoint. So, okay, that's all I've got, guys. Thank you. Thank you for the moderators for helping out today. We went super long, and I know some people complained about this being too long. It was not my intent, but going through those slides, just there was a lot to go through. I have another presentation. I'll do these every once in a while. I don't want to do them all the time because they are pretty lengthy, but I have one on Jude. I have one on conspiracy, and I have another one somewhere. I can't remember which, but they're on my website if you want to just look through the pages. But thank you guys for hanging out with me today. 510 of you, and I appreciate your faithfulness in this. Thank you for praying for me and for just being there. Tomorrow night, I believe Tyler is going to go. He's back. I talked to him the other day. He's finally gotten over this, upper respiratory infection he's had, and so he's on the mend. And if you hadn't checked out Chooch's video last night, check him out. Lee Brainerd had some good videos here out recently. Tom Hughes, JD Frog, the rest of these guys just continue to support the Watchmen community. And I just want to say thank you all, love you, and God bless you. And if all things work out, I'm going to try and have a live on Rumble on Friday. I don't expect it to be a big group, but I'm going to swing for the fences on that one as well too. Don't know what the topic is. I may talk about this new article that's coming out, the bleeding edge. So, and I'm going to try and get that done here the next day or so. So thank you guys. God bless, and I'll talk to you next time. Okay.